The role of Arabs in the slave trade, pioneers and participants in modern society. There is a peculiar phenomenon where discussions about the history of the African slave trade often focus on the brutal exploitation by European colonizers. However, the role of Arabs in the slave trade is an important, but often overlooked aspect of this dark chapter in human history. Long before European colonizers set foot on the African continent, Arabs were deeply involved in the trafficking of black populations, establishing extensive sales networks and trading markets. Arabs were not just participants in the slave trade, they were pioneers. Pre-Islamic and early Islamic slave trade involvement of Arabs in the slave trade can be traced back to the pre-Islamic era. From the 1st century AD, Arabs had already begun organized large-scale African black slave trade, much earlier than European colonizers. The Arabian Peninsula had a complex tribal society that was already engaged in various forms of trade, including the sale of slaves. The Arab slave trade has a long and brutal history, involving not only the plundering of Africans, but also the trafficking of European and Asian populations. In the Islamic world, slavery was a traditional trade activity that existed before the establishment of Islam. Slaves were seen as commodities that could be traded for gold, silver, or various daily necessities. Slavery was an integral part of their social and economic structure. With the rise of Islam in the 7th century, the Arab Empire expanded rapidly, controlling vast territories. This expansion facilitated the development of the slave trade network connecting Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. Arab merchants were adept at establishing and maintaining these routes, leveraging their geographical and political advantages. The arrival of Arabs in Africa brought not only the crown to the indigenous people, but also iron shackles and chains. In order to obtain slaves, Arabs used vicious means. The cruel methods used by Arabs in the slave trade are shocking. They would suddenly attack during the assembly day in the hinterland of Africa, causing a large number of Africans to die and rivers of blood, capturing the surviving men, women, and children. These terrifying methods were mainly to intimidate the local people and force them to submit to the will of the slave traders. These attacks were not isolated incidents, but a part of the daily life of Arabs. Arabs also exploited conflicts between African tribes, buying off the more powerful side as a pawn, going to the villages of the weaker side to grab people, and then selling them to Arab traffickers in exchange for a large amount of cheap daily necessities and firearms and ammunition. These captured Africans were forced to cross the Sahara Desert, and many people died on this difficult journey. Arabs also formed strategic alliances with African kings and tribal leaders, who provided slaves in exchange for textiles, weapons, and horses. These partnerships were mutually beneficial. African leaders obtained valuable trade goods, and Arabs obtained a stable supply of slaves. Trafficking routes and markets crossing the Sahara route was crucial for transporting slaves from West Africa to North Africa and other regions. The main routes include Timbuktu to Sijil Massa. Slaves from the western part of Sudan were brought to Timbuktu, then transported to Sijil Massa, now Morocco. Kano to Tripoli. Slaves from Hausa state were brought to the northern Kano, modern Nigeria, to the Mediterranean port of Tripoli, modern Libya. East African route slaves from the Swahili coast and the inland areas of East Africa were transported to the Arabian Peninsula and the Persian Gulf via coastal routes. The main routes include Kilwa Kisiwani to Arabia. Slaves from the Sultanate of Kilwa, located in modern Tanzania, were transported to Arabian ports. Zanzibar to Oman. Zanzibar was a major slave trade center. Slaves were transported to Oman and other parts of the Arabian Peninsula. Famous slave markets operated by Arab Zanzibar. Due to its special geographical location, Zanzibar became a very important transit station and trading center for slave traders. According to statistics, by the year 1000, the number of black slaves transported to Zanzibar each year reached about 15,000. The mortality rate of black slaves was very high, and slave traders eliminated the old, weak, sick, and disabled through the abuse of black slaves. Sijamasasigiumas, located in present-day Morocco, was an important trans-Saharan trade center where West African slaves were traded. Sofala, on the southeast coast of Africa, Sofala, located in present-day Mozambique, was another important port where slaves captured from the interior were sold and transported to Arab markets. The role played by Arabs in the slave trade is significant and far-reaching. As pioneers of human trafficking, Arabs established mature sales networks and trading markets, which were emulated and expanded by European colonizers centuries later. Understanding the full range of Arab participation in the slave trade can provide a more comprehensive understanding of this dark chapter in history. The atrocities of the slave trade are not limited to European colonialism. Arabs are also important participants in this evil act. Rather than the victims of colonialism, they now play everywhere.